Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Holding Space. It's an opportunity for us to get conversations going about what's happening with Unitarian Universalism and other things in the world. I am joined by my friend and companion and colleague, Reverend Abhi Janamanci. It's so good to see you, Reverend Abhi Janamanci. What a pleasure. And and our special guest today, our very special guest today, is the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker, someone who is widely known throughout Unitarian Universalism, mostly, I would say, for being a preeminent theologian of our time, but also being the former president of Starr King School for the Ministry. And what a joy it is to have you here. Rebecca recently appeared at the Spark conference that we had about where we are in Unitarian Universalism at the moment for our theological and philosophical stance. And Reverend Abi, why don't you say a few words in our welcome?
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. I'm Abhi Janamanci. I serve Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Bethesda, Maryland, and have been a joyful companion, co-conspirator, and colleague and friend with Reverend David Miller. And it is a joy to welcome the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker here with us for our conversation and that Spark conference that you mentioned, David, was powerful in so many ways. It brought us together to actually make space to be reflecting on what is our faith calling us to be and do in this time. And I thought you provided a really wonderful invitation to all of us to come together, and which is where we also got to hear Rebecca share her thoughts, and in that particular quote about the call for this time is to be building communities of resistance really struck a chord, and which I think is what we are going to be engaging with. So, but before we do that, welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Abhi and David. It's good to be with you. I'm grateful for the leadership you're giving for fostering open space for conversation. It's such an important time in our country, in the United States, and for Unitarian Universalism to really be reflecting on what we are experiencing happening in our communities and in our nation and in the world, because the national events are connected to movements, fascist movements all around the world. And so one of the great values of religious life is a commitment to reflection and analysis. We do not act without thinking. We value the importance of observation, reflection, consultation, and thinking together, which is what was happening at the Spark conference, which was a pleasure to be part of. The thoughtfulness of people, the openness of people, but also the urgency of this time that we are in can't be underestimated. So I know we will talk about that some, even what's happening right now this week in our country. I know this will be available to people to listen to at other moments, but we also can reflect on this moment right now. Both of you have demonstrated so much leadership and faithfulness and courage. I'm honored to be with you.
Thank you so much. Actually, just for a little context, in this moment, what we are experiencing are what's happening in Los Angeles, and and the police being augmented by military as called for by the president. So there's a lot going on in this moment. Rebecca, one of the things that we really heard coming out of the conference was this communities of resistance resonated with so many people. Would you be kind enough to explain a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Yes. Thank you. So, first of all, I meant to call us to be thinking deeply and courageously about what the purpose of our congregations is, what our mission is, and what our covenants are. And I wanted to advocate for us crystallizing our sense of mission and purpose as Unitarian Universalist congregations, that our purpose is to be communities of resistance. And this means embodiments, places that embody the alternatives, I think we should put in plural, the alternatives to what is happening in our larger society and culture that is dangerous, harmful, destructive, and threatening to all that we love, the people we love, the planet we love, the cities and towns we love, and obviously the neighbors we love. So to resist threat is the challenge or the call. And the question is, and to counter it. And the question is, what kinds of countering activities can we engage with in our congregations? And how courageous can we be in that? So these days, I have to, as a little aside, so much is asked of us and so much is moving so fast. One thing I didn't do before just this moment was manage to reread exactly what I said communities of resistance do. So I'm just going to may repeat some of that and may say some different things.
Rebecca, I also have in front of me the 5 things you did say.
Oh, why don't you say the 5 points? That would
Okay.
be great. I know a couple that I want to speak about further, but yes, please go ahead. I had it queued up, but I just didn't get through it.
Well, actually,
What did I say?
this comes from the work that we've been doing to present some sort of outline and curriculum to give folks from the Spark conference that we've been working on and getting close to doing. But first of all, it said Rebecca Parker invites us to resist and confront religious frameworks that cause harm and continue to break the silence against injustice, and that you encourage resistance through subversive strategies. And here are the 5 things that you said: love one another, prefigure change, make reparations, shelter freedom of belief, and be grounded in radical joy and transpersonal sources of power. Does that sound familiar?
Be grounded. What was the 4th one?
Shelter freedom of belief.
Yeah, shelter freedom of belief. But yes, and that's what I would also mean by that is critical thinking.
So, Rebecca, I'm curious about what prompted this framing for you. You know, if there was a particular moment or experience that brought these 5 aspects into focus when you talk about, you know, we must resource our congregations to be communities of resistance.
That's a wonderful question, Abhi, and it's perhaps a variety of things. One is we've been reflecting so much with the rise of Christian nationalism, or what some call Christian fascism, into political power in our country. It's still not a majority of America's people, but it's enough majority to have an active enough faction in our United States life to have elected people into power who are behaving in, shall we say, very dangerous and threatening ways. And David mentioned, you know, right now the National Guard has been called into Los Angeles, where a rather small handful of people have been protesting ICE activities, and but it's being used as an excuse to escalate military presence and to override the governor of California who's protesting. And in just a few days here in Washington, D.C., we're going to have this enormous military parade, and tanks are arriving on train cars from Texas to Washington, D.C. all sorts of military vehicles. And this morning, Robert Reich said we have to understand that we're seeing the groundwork laid for a police state. And that's what we're seeing. And one friend of mine said, once these tanks get to Washington, D.C. for the parade, are they going to stay here? So we have to be asking these kinds of questions and have our eyes open around what's going on. So because of this rise of Christian fascism, Christian nationalism, lots of people are naturally turned to the lessons from the past, especially the rise of Nazism in Germany in particular. And I think I mentioned at the Spark conference that, or at least I did it in my research preparing for that conference, James Luther Adams remains so important to us because he documented, he was in Germany during the beginning of this shift, and he documented the rise of fascism in Germany. Yeah, I quoted him in the talk I gave you at Spark, and he said it's going to come. It can come here. He smuggled documents out of Germany. That was a kind of resistance to be able to keep documenting it. And he emphasized so much that we need to think about our ecclesiology, what the purpose of the church is. So, my thoughts go to rise of fascism in Europe, to James Luther Adams' resistance to that, to the kinds of things he called us to as people of progressive faith or liberating faith, and his emphasis on voluntary associations, on the church as a covenant of, not an exclusive covenant, but a covenant of all beings, is the way he expanded it, which is really important because covenants can be used very destructively, as they were in South Africa. Covenantal theology was the basis of creating the reservation system in North America for indigenous people. That was all covenantal theology. We have to be aware that even covenants can be used for harm. But the covenant of all being is the broadest inclusiveness of affirmation for the rights, the importance, the sacred worth of all beings, all people. And that is fundamental to our ecclesiology. So first part of your question is, how did I get to thinking about communities of resistance? It was partly by thinking about James Luther Adams. He doesn't use the term communities of resistance, though. I learned the term from a dialogue between the Thich Nhat Hanh and I think it's Daniel Berrigan, because remember, Thich Nhat Hanh was a resistor to the Vietnam War, and he, in a dialogue with Berrigan, talked about the importance of communities of resistance, which we saw in the 60s and 70s peace movements, where also community building was a big part of that. And also in the movements that I was first part of as a young minister, when the crises in Central America were happening, Salvador, and the beginning of the sanctuary movement, the small affinity groups, small collective bodies of people committed to resisting and supporting one another, because resistance just doesn't happen in isolation. There has to be a collective. But I also was thinking about, and I'm going to recommend this, the small community in France that famously sheltered so many Jewish children, Chambord. And there's a beautiful film called Weapons of the Spirit, which I think it's not a new film now. It's been out for a couple decades, maybe 3 or 4, but I think people can find it online. I would recommend that we show it in our congregations again, because it asks the question, what enabled this village to so courageously save the lives of Jewish children? It involved all sorts of subterfuge. It involved lying to the authorities. It involved creating false documents. And the answer to the question of how and why they were able to do this is that they were French Huguenots with a long history of being a minoritized religious community and dissenters. And the film shows them gathered for worship singing their songs, singing their hymns. And the hymns tell about the courage of their ancestors. And the hymns pray that we too will have the strength and keep faith with our ancestors. So those pieces together made me think, when we look at historic contexts where faith communities made a difference in, at the very least, ameliorating the harm that's happening, but resisting and stopping the harm can take a lot of creative and courageous action. If we look historically, we can see what is it that enabled the communities to be that.
Well,
And
I want to talk about that actually for a minute,
yeah,
Rebecca, which is both Abhi and I have many federal employees in
right,
our congregation. And we've been trying to provide opportunities for those federal employees to be together and talk and provide them with pastoral care and resources and a place for them to speak their truth in confidence and also plan for how they might react when things happen. And the thing that
yeah,
struck me in those some of those meetings is the level of cruelty that is being perpetrated by the government
yeah,
in both words and deeds, emails, words, deeds, actions. I mean, there have been people who've said to me, I have no, I asked my boss what this means, and my boss has no idea what it means because no
yeah,
one's consulted with them. And so one of the things that has been meaningful for us is just to help create this space for people to be there. And so the role of progressive faith, one of the things that you said, I think that struck me in the Spark conference, is a community of resistance is also bringing forth kindness when there's cruelty, right? And so
yes,
resistance is broadly defined in progressive faith. So I just wondered what you might have to say about that.
yes. And I'll say in our the congregation I'm part of here in Central DC is also doing this and supporting federal workers. And it was Adam Server who famously now said, "Cruelty is the point." And so part of our religious resistance is an alternative religious understanding, but it also helps for us to stay alert that cruelty is religiously sanctioned in right-wing Christianity. Once, as Hosea Ballou said in 1804, once you, I'm paraphrasing, once you imagine a God who is pleased by the torture and crucifixion of his own child as a way of making peace, if you believe that, those who believe that are going to become even more cruel. And the theology that divides the saved from the damned, those who are going to be raptured into the new creation, or these apocalyptic theologies are present in the religious right. Who's going to get either in the secular form of escape to Mars is about as real as the religious form of escape into a new world. But the social consequence of those are that those who are considered outside of the grace of God or the elite community or the saved community, they are expendable, they are to be resisted, they are even to be imprisoned or tortured, or and these are all versions of eternally damned. So the fact that we preach universal salvation is, we need to remember that this is actually a counter to the religion that's happening. And we have to operationalize the way it's counter. So the support groups for federal workers are an embodiment of countering that. And the love one another is, as we speak about how we're grounded in love and centered on all-inclusive love, to keep the edge of that alive, that it's an edgy thing, it's a resistant thing to say this and to believe this and to make it real. So we practice it, but in the most elemental ways in our congregations, by our hospitableness to one another, our kindness, our love one another, and we expand out from that to the acts of love that are directly countering the cruelty that is happening in whatever way we can see to do it. And of course, the cruelty also is terrorizing to everyone else. If I can comment about that for a minute, because I think that's very difficult. The threat that is happening, the way that threatens, and the pervasiveness of it, and even the last Trump regime, we were succeeding in making our congregations sanctuary spaces for immigrant communities. And now there's even an attack on the legal traditions of safe space in the church property. So I want to keep the spirit of conversation among us going, but I also want to say the other component, Abhi, of why I thought about communities of resistance is the research and scholarship I've done about the early centuries of Christianity, because Christianity began as a resistant community, a community of people that were resisting the cruelty of the Roman Empire and its policies. And its policies included ways of grabbing land and resources by putting people in so much, raising the taxes so high that poor people had to mortgage their lands to pay their taxes, and then their land is confiscated. That was the Roman strategy in Jesus' time. And also, Jesus, the best we know, the historic Jesus, grew up in a village that was like 2 or 3 kilometers from a community that had been burned to the ground by the Romans, by the Roman occupiers during the years that he would have been coming of age. So to understand that the early Christian communities were resisting a cruel empire that was also oppressing the religious freedom of the Jewish community at that time, and what were the strategies of that community of resistance? And the love one another comes from there. That and
Well, he was a revolutionary Jewish preacher, right?
Yes, revolution, and
Where
it was
the Sermon on the Mount spoke to the politics of the day. Uh,
and to keep alive, David, that Jesus was a Jew, and this was a Jewish community of resistance.
right.
So that, but even into the 4th century, we all tell this story about how once Christianity was co-opted by the empire, that was like the end of resistant Christianity, but it actually wasn't. There's a wonderful story, for example, about the church in Jerusalem. In the 4th century, Constantine is sending all this money to Jerusalem to build up the churches, and he sends gold and silver candelabras and stuff. But then there's a famine, and the church in Jerusalem sells all the things the Roman Empire gave them so they can feed the hungry. And this, of course, makes the empire furious. But that kind of resistance was still happening even after you start to have an imperial church. There's still a resistant church. And of course, our Jewish, the Jewish prophetic tradition remains so powerfully important, even as it is under attack now, where conscientious Jews are not free to criticize Israel.
Right, right. Your framing of the communities of resistance, I think James Luther Adams talked about schools of the spirit, if I remember correctly, in the context of the five smooth stones of religious liberalism.
Yeah.
But it also reminded me of both, the concept of satyagraha. Mahatma Gandhi, really cultivated, but that was connected to being communities of resistance in the twin concepts of Sarvodaya, which is collective liberation, and also the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is the world is one family, which is similar to the beloved community. But the piece that really struck me was something that my friend Dr. Daryl Fashing, who taught at the University of South Florida, came up with two concepts and draws a very clear distinction. One is sacred society versus holy community. And he talks about it in the context of the Huguenots and there being a community of resistance. And I'm trying to remember what he said about a sacred society. He said is marked by exclusion, purity, and conformity, seeking to enforce sameness, morally, spiritually, religiously, and it often defines itself over and against others. That the outsiders are impure. And a sacred society is usually closed. It is hierarchical and it seeks security through control. And societies that are built this way are vulnerable to becoming authoritarian and even violent in the name of protecting truth or God. Whereas a holy community, he says, by contrast, is marked by hospitality, vulnerability, and compassion. And a holy community, and this is where he really lifts up the Huguenot community in saying how it welcomed the stranger. Yes. And was open to transformation by encounter. And in this context, he lifts up the story of Jacob wrestling with the stranger, and then saying that holiness is not in purity, but in relationship, especially across difference. And the sacred, he says, is encountered in moments of justice and mutual care and mercy. And he lays this all out in the context of the ethics of interdependence, which is a beautiful essay that he wrote. But it kind of lifted up to me, in some ways about how, Unitarian Universalism at its core is about being a holy community, not a sacred society. Yes, in practice, we sometimes move towards being a sacred society. Even with our liberating theology, we sometimes fall into that. One way we talk about it is we are a community of like-minded people, and in our case, our center is at the margins. In that we choose not to create which is where I have some issues with putting love at the center, but that's a different conversation. But in that context, Rebecca, my question is, how do we move more fully into being holy communities, embodying that love ethic that you talk about and in those, and centering that, and from that place really living into the other aspects that you lift up, including reparations and working toward mutual transformation, and such. I was just wondering about how, because I see them all interconnected, that this is not a checklist that you offered us, but actually something that builds with and on each other.
Yes, exactly. Abhi, thank you so much for this beautiful reference. The Ethics of Independence, is that what you said is the name of his essay, Darrell Cashman?
No, I can send you. I'll look it
Yes,
up and then send you. It's actually the ethics of interdependence, but
of
I don't know if,
interdependence.
yeah.
But that's so helpful to the difference between sacred society and holy community. It's also kind of, the sacred society is sort of like theocracy as well, and marked by hospitality, vulnerability, and compassion. There's so much in what you just said and asked, but there's something I specifically want to talk about, and that is the satyagraha and the cultivation of nonviolent resistance, because that's the one thing I've been thinking about further since the 5 things that David helpfully reminded us of. And I've been thinking about it because of what's happening in Los Angeles right now, where the resistance to the ICE raids and to the militarization of opposition to protesters is very concerning for what further may happen in the direction of police state. And the descriptions of what's happening in LA right now are all these police in riot gear. And I don't know if either of you or others of our listeners have confronted massive police in their riot gear with their helmets and their shields. And the one time I had an experience of that, the visceral fear in the crowd at this, just the sight of I saw them coming down the street towards a gathering of people, and there were rows and rows of motorcycle cops and all these shields, and there had been nothing terribly unruly in the crowd except somebody had thrown a rock that hit a light and shattered the glass, and that happening was the excuse to bring in this massive force of militarized police. But what I experienced when I saw that was just plain visceral fear, and you could feel it in the whole crowd of people. And for a few people, the instinct is to confront, but mostly the instinct, it was mine, is to get out of there, is to run. It's really scary. It's really scary. And so fear tactics, terrorization tactics, the same as David's question about the cruelty happening to the federal workers. We need to be reflecting on the religious foundation or spiritual practices that may strengthen our capacity to not be overwhelmed by fear. The New Testament says perfect love casts out fear. And I think the whole point of the story in Christianity, and also for the Jewish resistors who were killed at Masada, when you start to have the notion of, in both first century Judaism and early Christianity, of the resurrection of the martyrs, of those who are killed by the empire, is, it's a narrative for affirming that those who have resisted, even if they are killed, are not destroyed. And the spirit of resistance is not destroyed. There's life is stronger than death, or love is louder than hate, or love is stronger than death. These are not easy religious perspectives to hold, because I mean, it sounds easy. I mean, it sounds good, but when I was confronted with that police presence, fear took hold. Just it's in the nervous system. So the spiritual training of our bodies to not be terrified, so that the tactics of terror, the tactics of threatening crucifixion, the tactics of of violence uh, are can't be so effective, because that it only takes a few examples of this kind of violence for all the rest of us to become paralyzed by fear. Um, and so I found myself walking and thinking this morning about how important it might be to revisit the trainings that happened during the civil rights movement. It happened in the Indian freedom movements on nonviolent resistance. And because the folks in LA threw eggs at the police, at least that's what the news reports. It could have been one person that did that.
Right.
We don't really know what happened. I haven't seen anybody fact checking that yet out of the news. Could have been just a few little things like the experience I was in, where one rock, one light, one shattering of glass. But that means that the resistance has got to be a disciplined nonviolence, and it has to be, according to people who study how you stop fascism, 3.5% of the population can stop fascism, but it has to be nonviolent resistance. So how do we train to operationalize love? I like love at the margins. We're trying to bring love at the margins. How do we operationalize it? Part of it may be to be really intentional in our congregations to do training and spiritual development and practice. I mean, in the civil rights movement, Abhi, maybe you can comment more about this from what you know in your studies of Satyagraha, but they practiced being confronted by the police. They practiced how to not return, not aggravate, and to stay calm. Now, nonviolent resistance during the civil rights movement was critiqued by the Black Power movement. And it was critiqued by feminist theologians like me, who said the whole theory of passive resistance or nonviolent resistance is that your enemy will be moved by seeing your suffering to change. That's part of that was, as I understand it, part of Gandhi's theory, that it's an appeal to the morality of the other. And even King himself started to become discouraged that the morality of the other, of the white dominant culture in America, could not be trusted. It wasn't moral enough to respond. The British maybe were moral enough to respond to India. But even that, so I think that piece of it has to be rethought, reflected upon again. Because the Black Power movement said we got to resist force with force. And I feel at this point in my life, after all we've seen through our various movements, moves me to think again about nonviolent resistance. But I'm not sure the theory is that it will move the opponents, your suffering will move the opponent. It may just be the witness to, it may just be resisting and refusing to use violence is morally and ethically and even strategically what we need to do. What could you say some more, Abhi, about this? And we've had conversations around spiritual practice, and for Unitarian Universalists, we're really great about our ideals and our commitments, and we act on them. But to build the soul force strength, to not let fear of death, fear of punishment, fear of and to know when to let fear guide us appropriately and when to resist fear. These are difficult, deep human
Abhi, I wanted to just say that I thought about one of the things that you said that I think applies actually is that transformation through encounter. And the way that we welcome the stranger in our congregations is operationalizing the thing that you're talking about, I think, Rebecca, and what Abhi talked about. Because it can't be
Yeah.
just because we want new members. This has
Right.
to be a spiritual and religious practice about
Yes.
us, how we're practicing resistance in this world by opening ourselves up in a vulnerable way to experience the other. People aren't joining our congregations to us, they're not joining us. We are coming together. All of us are coming together.
Yeah.
And with each new person, the place changes, right? And so how do we open ourselves up in a spiritual practice for transformation through encounter? And I love that holy community thought that you had. So I apologize for interjecting, but yeah,
No.
you're muted, Abhi. That has to happen during one Zoom call. You're muted, Abhi.
Mhm.
Thank you, David. That's a good point. Gandhiji called satyagraha as militant nonviolent resistance.
Mhm.
It kind of sounds like an oxymoron to use militant as an adjective before nonviolence, but that's how he's brought it together as an embodied practice. And you're right, Rebecca. There were training sessions,
Mhm.
extensive training that people had to undergo before they engaged in satyagraha. The scene in the film Gandhi of the Salt Satyagraha, where lines and lines of people march forward, where there are the police state is ready with batons to beat them down, and as each row gets beaten down, they don't resist. They just stand and they smash those batons against their faces and their skulls and their bodies, and they're bleeding and they fall. And then the next line moves up, and then the next line, and then the next line, which goes on for hours and hours until the police are tired and the sticks are all broken, but the people keep coming up. And that was the whole purpose of engaging in nonviolent resistance. And it wasn't passive, it was militant in that way. And in an active way that actually began to have an impact, because you're right, Gandhiji wanted to appeal to the humanity of the other, the oppressor, in a way that would transform and change their mind and their heart, which in turn he felt would lead to freedom. And there was extensive correspondence between him and Martin Buber.
Yes.
And Buber questioned the whole premise of satyagraha and basically said, well, it worked with the British, it would never work with the Nazis. And maybe he was right. But on the other hand, Gandhiji's approach and his brilliance in that approach was in figuring out what would be an effective strategy that in turn would lead towards freedom, a strategy that was grounded in the principles both of faith and culture, which is what he drew from.
That's a really good point, which is the strategy does need to be contextualized. And gosh, I don't know the answer to the question, what will work with Christian fascism. Germany was Christian fascism too. And the British Empire wasn't so much religious imperialism as it was economic imperialism, cultural imperialism. And I've worked with the religious right on in the LGBTQ struggle. And what I learned, because there was in my home tradition, in addition to my Unitarian Universalist life, I have these roots in life connected to the United Methodist Church. And the United Methodist Church finally split after a 50-year struggle in which those, I'll say of us who were Methodists who were advocating for inclusion and affirmation, could not persuade the other half of the, which actually was a slight minority, but a powerful minority, of the loving righteousness of inclusion. We could not. And what I learned in some very deep engaged dialogues was that the difference went to the heart of how people experienced what it was to be a Christian. And my opponents, if I may say, put it this way, our opponents experienced Christianity as submission to the loving strictures of an authoritarian father who controls, who enables people to be good through the threat of punishment and the promise of reward. And this was so deep for people that the notion that you would take away the threats that keep people obedient to heteronormativity, it would destroy their whole sense of what it was to be a Christian. They wanted to be good to lesbian and gay people, but they couldn't. It would have taken a transformation of the whole religious experience of identity and personhood. I don't know where we go with that. This is like back to what George Lakoff told us about the difference between the left and the right.
I was just thinking about that.
That was helpful. It's frameworks of meaning, and those frameworks of meaning are stronger than you can't persuade people with ideas.
Well, Rebecca, we
Some
are.
people, at any rate,
Yeah.
yes. Are we the end of our time?
Well, we promised you about a half an hour, and we've gone way beyond that. And
Okay.
actually,
Okay. Thank you.
I'd like to say that I would love to have you back on another episode to talk about things as well, if you're willing. Yeah, hopefully we could arrange that. I know we're all going our separate ways for parts of the summer now, but and
Yeah.
the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly is coming up in another week or two. But thank you so much for this conversation. It's riveting to me, and I am so deeply grateful for who you are and how you help us understand things in these difficult times, because we are all searching for some sort of framework and understanding to try and live through this.
Yeah. Thank you, David. And thank you, Abhi. I can see Abhi's going to have a last word. So I want to just say the main thing I've been probably trying to communicate in this dialogue is I think there's some questions, things we need to think through more deeply that come from our religious heritage to help us now. And they really are, how do we deal with fear? How do we deal with the fear of death and with threat and with violence? And what are the strategies in the context we are in that can adequately resist and hopefully transform the situation we're in? And we need to be conferring deeply about this from what we know, from what you know, Abhi, what you know, David, what we know from our ancestors, really.
Thank you, Rebecca. I was going to say that we would love to continue this conversation and go deeper into some of the other aspects of what you have lifted up, especially what it means to shelter freedom of belief and to make reparations and ground our congregational life in radical joy and transformation. Wow, those would be, I think, really rich aspects that be wonderful if we're able to explore those with you a little bit more, especially as David and I serve communities, and if we were to take just one of these seriously for a year, what would you hope they would discover or be changed by? I'd love to explore those with you, and what gives you hope in the midst of all this, that this is possible, not just in moments, but over time.
I'm rethinking my allergy to hope as well. So
you wrote a book called The House of Hope.
I know, that's what I was going to say.
And I protested in the beginning of the book. I think I protested. Responsive hope in response. My allergy to hope has to do with imagining a future in a way that gets you disconnected from the present. So as long as we're really engaged in the present, then I can talk about hope. Engaged in the present is, to me, the greater challenge than having hope. But
we'll talk about that next. We'll talk about that next time.
All right. Let's have more. I thank you both for your ministries and for this free for all conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Okay.